I tend to do that after I do the housekeeping. So, welcome to a presentation and conversation with Robin Wood. This presentation is a part of our Vose or Virtual Wednesday series. My name is Deborah Lay, and I'm the Library Director at Vose Library. We're happy that you've chosen to spend the next hour with us. And here is some housekeeping reminders. Please be sure to remain muted during the presentation. The chat room will remain open for your convenience should you want to provide comments as we proceed. And Robin is very comfortable with me unmuting myself and asking those questions along the way. So please feel free to do that. We'll do that in sort of an organic way. And then we will have a question and answer session at the end as well. If you want to unmute at that point, and you can ask the question of the presenter. So this entire presentation will be recorded. This entire presentation will be recorded, and should you not want your image represented in that recording, we ask that you turn off your video at this time. Although I do know that presenters do enjoy, because we cannot be in person, they do enjoy seeing people. So if you're able to, that would be terrific to keep your video on.
Yes,
I'm going to now, yeah.
love to see your faces.
I am now going to hit the record button. As an introduction, we like to acknowledge that our mission at Vose Library is to advance learning, inspire curiosity, enrich lives, and promote community. And with that in mind, let me introduce our guest. Robin Clifford Wood is an author, poet, blogger, and essayist. She has a BA from Yale, an MA in English from University of Rochester, and an MFA in creative writing from the University of Southern Maine's Stone Coast program. Wood's writing has been featured in Port City Life magazine, Bangor Metro, Bangor Daily News, Maine Public Radio's Music That Moves Me series, the Maine Review, and Solstice Literary magazine, which published her essay, How Do You Help Your Parents Die? One of her poems won national recognition, and another was produced by Penobscot Theatre Company. Wood lives in central Maine with her husband and an old dog that I just got to meet named Clara. The Field House, a writer's life lost and found on an island in Maine, is her first book. And without further ado, please help me welcome Robin Wood. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you so much. And many, many thanks to Vose Library for hosting this event, and to you, Deborah, for inviting me to speak to you guys this evening. I appreciate you guys tuning in on a chilly evening that promises winter. I'm sorry you're struggling with your technology, Patricia, but we all sympathize. It's a struggle for all of us. I think it's. I hope you get that sorted out. Oh, wonderful to see you, Patricia. Now I can see your face. And I'm wondering if you guys could show me yourselves on video or make a comment in the chat box, because one thing I like to know when I start, since my book was released about 6.5 months ago at this point, I'm wondering how many of you have read the book. And if everyone has read it, I might do some things a little differently than if some of you have not read it. So no, have not read it? Okay, so Elizabeth has not. And Patricia, have you read the book yet? Maybe you can't hear me. Not sure. And David and Doug. Yeah, sorry that's not working for you, but that's okay. I know a couple of people now have not read the book, so I'll go ahead and introduce some things. And you know, you may hear, I may may read some parts you've read before, but that's okay too. So first of all, I just want to say what an amazing experience this 9-year journey has been for me to write this book. I should say at this point, it's more like 13. It was 9 years to write and research the book, 2 years before I found a publisher who was willing to take a chance on it. And that was She Writes Press, which is a fabulous hybrid press based out of off the West Coast. And then another 2 years between when I got the publish call and held the book in my hand. So it's quite a long process. So I think one of the best ways for me to introduce the book, and here's a picture of it. I guess I've got a nice poster of it in the background here. I like to read the prologue because this says a lot of the introductory things that I like to tell people about. In 1994, my husband and I purchased a long abandoned wood frame house on an island off the coast of Maine. In the 1920s and 30s, it had been the summer house of author Rachel Field on the island that inspired all her most successful work, the poetry, plays, children's books, and novels that took her from struggling writer to Newbery medalist, National Book Award winner, then rising Hollywood success. She also won a Caldecott Award posthumously. And she was, and she had a #1 New York Times bestseller in the very first ever bestseller list that they published in 1942. I only just learned that a couple of weeks ago.
Robin, your voice went out when you told us the name of the woman. I didn't know who you're talking about.
Oh, Rachel Field.
Okay.
Yes, yes, thank you for pointing that out. So Rachel Field is the name of the author, and she was very decorated. At the peak of her renown, she died suddenly and unexpectedly, leaving so many stories untold, including her own. Excuse me, I'm gonna get myself some more light. Oops. When I first walked onto the island home that had been her magical place, her muse, some of those stories reached out tendrils, looking for a place to attach themselves. I felt their presence in the flutters of my heart, but did not know at the time what it meant. Many people know the sensation of entering an old house and feeling something of its history in the air. It whispers from the corners, buzzes indecipherably in the motes of dust illuminated by a ray of sunlight through wavy glass. The building retains some indefinable quality left behind by its former inhabitants, some of their energy lingering in the atmosphere. On an island with no roads, only footpaths and wooden wheelbarrows, the leavings of former inhabitants are not just figurative. Rachel's weighty wooden sleigh bed is still there in the room where she slept. The old wicker chairs in front of the fireplace creak under my weight as they creaked under hers. Her Scotty dog trinkets and paraphernalia wait expectantly, pointy ears on alert, on shelves and in drawers. I sit on the front porch, the covered piazza, as Rachel called it, and I contemplate the same view of Seal Harbor and Acadia National Park's Rocky Top Mountains across an expanse of sea called the Eastern Way. That same view inspired Rachel's creative work, her joy, and her loneliness. Rachel's life was not easy. It was not all fairy houses and moon glow, or silver streaks of rain on city streets, or soaring gulls alighting gracefully on the barnacled rocks of an island off the coast of Maine, even though her work is alive with all those wonders. It wasn't a life of deep deprivation either. Her family had enough means to get by and the social status to be accepted into most echelons of the stratified society of her time. The difficulties in Rachel's life were more situational and internal. First, there was her physical presence. Many who knew her effervescent spirit on the page were shocked to meet Rachel for the first time, for she was not the elfin sprite they expected, but a woman of imposing stature and heavy masculine features. Her warmth quickly eclipsed superficial impressions. She had a lightness about her, something open and engaging that made people feel like an old friend at her kitchen table. Nevertheless, her exterior self caused her a lifetime of rue. I also sensed that her story was weighty with much deeper disappointments, even before I'd begun my research. There were shadows of loss, heartbreak, secrecy, a sister gone mad, an improper marriage, infertility, a child who seemed to disappear, so many unanswered questions. But Rachel's story, I was certain, held more than anything a prodigious share of redemption and hopefulness. I was certain not only because of Rachel's work, but because I inhabited her space. So that gives you a little sense of the background to my getting into this book and this story about Rachel Field. Back in the 1990s, my husband and I found this house for sale on Sutton Island, which is a tiny little mile-long, half-mile-wide island. It's one of the Cranberry Islands off the coast of Mount Desert. And there are no roads, there's no town, there's no, there is electricity and plumbing, as I think the electricity came in 1938. So when Rachel Field first started going there in 1911, everything was gas lighting and pumps for water and much more rugged and rustic living. But when you move off that island, you tend to leave everything behind because no one wants to lug all of those large pieces of furniture across the island on a wheelbarrow or carry it in your hands. So when you move in, you're moving into a historic piece, which is really kind of cool. And my husband's family had had one of the other houses on that island since the 50s. So I'd known the island for a while, and houses don't come up for sale very often. So we were excited not only to have this house for sale, but for me, I also knew that it was the house of a writer, and even more than one. Later, after Rachel, there was a poet who was a quite successful poet who lived there, an illustrator for the Saturday Evening Post, a composer, did a lot of his composing work in that same house. He was an Academy Award nominated composer. So there were a lot of artsy people there, and I aspired to be a writer myself. And I was so excited to be in that space and in that place. And I had also heard this one particular poem that was written by Rachel Field. It was the one thing that I knew by Rachel. And I'd like to read that for you too. I used the last stanza of it as my epilogue, but here's how it goes. If once you have slept on an island, you'll never be quite the same. You may look as you looked the day before and go by the same old name. You may bustle about in street and shop. You may sit at home and sew, but you'll see blue water and wheeling gulls wherever your feet may go. You may talk to the neighbors of this and that and close to your fire keep, but you'll hear ship whistle and lighthouse bell and tides beat through your sleep. Oh, you won't know why, and you can't say how such change upon you came. But once you have slept on an island, you'll never be quite the same. Have any of you ever heard of that poem? Well, that was familiar to me, and also became a very precious poem to me. And really, everyone who lives in the Cranberry Islands, I bet, a vast percentage of the locals have this poem posted somewhere on the walls of their house. It's very, very beloved work by Rachel Field. So when I first moved into this place, as I said, I didn't know much about Rachel Field, and it was quite a long time. I was a full-time mom for many, many years. I have 4 children, and I decided to stay home to raise them. And a lot of what this book is also about is the path that Rachel Field led me on, that helped me really claim and embrace the life of a writer for real, for the first time in my life. I had published for years, but very sporadically and maybe almost apologetically. I had that imposter syndrome and, oh, I'm not a real writer thing going on. And but I had written a column in Massachusetts. I wrote a column for the Bangor Daily News for 5 years, but I never felt like I had the discipline or the consistency to really take it to the next level. And when I started reading Rachel's work, she inspired me. Her poetry was very much like the poetry that I like writing myself. And the light that she sheds in her writing, it's uplifting writing. She had a deep reverence for beauty, and I was so captivated by her voice on the page. She had a wisdom about human interactions and a sensitivity to appreciating beauty in both the underside of things and the exterior world. So I started reading more and more of her work, and then I got curious about her life as I lived in this house where, as I say, I was sitting in the furniture that she sat in. I was using the same old ceramic bowl that she used to cook in the kitchen. And it just became sort of a captivating notion that I was walking in her footsteps. So over time, as I began in Great Cranberry Isles, where Great Cranberry Island has a museum with a corner dedicated to Rachel Field and Hitty, who was the doll protagonist of her Newbery-winning book. It's called Hitty, Her First 100 Years. And Rachel Field was the first woman to win a Newbery Award for that book. And Hitty really launched her into fame. And the people on Great Cranberry Island have embraced Hitty and Rachel Field because of their connection to their local area. And a number of people on Great Cranberry Island had been Rachel Field collectors and had started this museum space, and they launched my research and connected me to a bunch of threads to follow. I had no idea when I first pitched a story to write an article about Rachel Field for a magazine that was the beginning of a 9-year writing and research project. In the end, I traveled to archive collections in Massachusetts and New York and Connecticut and Louisiana and California. Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which was her childhood home. It turned into a treasure hunt, and I started getting invited to talk about Rachel Field all over the country, even before I finished writing the book. So I'll tell you another thing that we haven't actually mentioned about this book. It's listed as its genre as a biography memoir hybrid. I began writing this just as a biography of Rachel Field, but every time I gave a talk about her in Southwest Harbor or in Orono, Maine, or in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, or one time a Sutton Islander flew me to Tampa, Florida to talk at a literary conference about biography, and just felt sort of unreal. But people would smile and nod. But then as soon as I started talking about sharing this space with her, and then an ongoing string of coincidences that seemed to connect me with her or to keep drawing me back into the project when I got discouraged and put it away, sometimes for weeks or months at a time. And people got so excited about that. They said, you've got to put that in your book. You have to include your story about how she moved you along. And you got an article about about it, and you got asked to talk about her, and all of these things that she brought to your life. And I resisted for the longest time because I really became enamored of this woman, and it was like I was on a mission to bring her light back to the world, because what I was trying to sort out was the mystery of her disappearance. I knew she died young, but it was unclear why exactly. I heard she'd had a daughter, but there was no sign of that daughter. And as it turns out, there was quite a lot of tragedy around her death. And I'm not gonna, it would be too much of a spoiler alert to go into it too much. But I was pained by the realization that this woman whose writing and whose life modeled delight in the world and a joy in the world's beauty had been shadowed by tragedy for all these years. And my mission was to bring her back to the world and tell her story. And I'd say to people, this is not about me. I don't want to step in. I didn't want my voice to be in there. Then in 2016, 8 years into the 9-year book journey, I went to a writing conference, and the writing instructor said, he gave a prompt in our class, and he said, write a letter to someone who will never read it. And I immediately wrote, Dear Rachel, at the top of the page. I think I might have said, Dear Rachel, are you mad at me? Because I was worried a lot of the time that that maybe I was revealing more of her life than she would have wanted to. But I think the secret keepers around Rachel's life were more her husband and other people in her life. She was quite progressive for her time. And I became convinced over time that she really wanted me to write this book, partly because I couldn't help feeling like she kept on nudging me when I slacked off to keep me going. When these calls would come in, these coincidental calls saying, oh, there's this incredible archive collection where your kid's going to college. And so I got to visit my child and do my mom thing at the same time that I got to do my research. So what I ended up doing that after that epiphany of writing that one letter was over the next year, I wrote many letters to Rachel Field, and I wrote them to track the progress of how my life, my personal life and my writing life were changed so dramatically by engaging in this wonderful relationship with a woman that I never got to meet. And so that seemed to make it all come together and click. So it's really two stories. I'd say 85% of it is Rachel's story, but I precede each chapter with a letter from me to Rachel. And that's sort of braided in with Rachel's story. And it tells another story with parallels and differences from a whole different century. So I have a bunch of, any questions so far or anything? If you feel like I've left something out, I'm happy to veer off, because I tend to interrupt myself with tangents all the time. So I'm happy to be interrupted by somebody else as well. Okay, I am going to share my screen and show you some pictures. Hang on just a minute here. All right, I hope you can see this. I thought it would be nice to give you a little context. So this is the view from in front of my house on Sutton Island. And this, just to be clear, this is a summer house, and it can't be winterized because the water lines all go overland. So you have to drain the pipes every fall. So it's a summer place. And we try to stretch it. We stretched it into November this year. We had some time out there late season, so that was nice. And there's a sunrise looking from another part of the yard outside our house. And I have a few pictures of the house itself. It's kind of a collection of individual buildings up on brick piers. And that's the water in front. And we have a great new addition to our photography in our house. The kids gave Jonathan, my husband Jonathan, a drone for Christmas. So we have our first ever aerial photos of the house. It's kind of fun. So that's our house in the foreground. I think you can see it here, and we're looking across at Mount Desert Island. That's on of those two humps. That's Cadillac on the right, and I think Pematic on the left, looking straight across north to Seal Harbor. Oops. And there I am with Clara, just a few weeks ago. So as you can see, there's the big main house in the front to the right. And then there's a separate kitchen building, and then a little L with bunk rooms in it that I suspect used to belong to the very first family that built the house in 1898, had their house staff lived back there. And then there's yet another square building. I think I have a picture of it here. This building far to the right here was a laundry room. There's still an old slop sink in there, and we had a wood stove and flat irons for ironing. But Rachel Field used that for her studio. That's where she did her writing back in the 1920s and 30s. And this is just to orient you for people who don't know the area. There's Sutton Island. Can you see my arrow going around? Don't know if you can. Okay, good. So there's Sutton Island, and these are the Great Cranberry and Little Cranberry, and that archipelago there. The interior of the island just looks like a magic world of mossy landscape, and that's one of my favorite places to walk on the island. Is through these fields of moss. You feel like you're in a fairyland. And just some other scenic shots of the shoreline. That's a historic shot of the front of the house. And that fence was long gone before I arrived in the late 70s. This is a cool thing. I think I referred to this old shopping list that's still hanging on the wall of the kitchen, with things like, you could see alum, ammonia. These are the clothesline and clothespins, the things that people felt were the shopping essentials, lamp chimneys and lamp wicks and lard. I think it's really an interesting piece of Americana there. And Rachel Field, in addition to being a playwright and a poet and a children's writer and a novelist, she also was an illustrator, and she illustrated a bunch of her own books. This is her first book of poetry called The Pointed People, and she did all these silhouette illustrations in them. And one of the things that I found on the shelves was this old linen dish towel with Rachel's initials embroidered into them. It's now happily on display. And these Scotty dog things, which I later learned was all Rachel's, because she always had a Scotty dog pet. But this key was the key we used to open the kitchen for the first 10 years we lived in this house. And I opened one of her books of poetry, and there's Rachel's silhouette illustration of that very key. And she called the house, since I've been going to Sutton Island, has been known as the Field House in honor of Rachel Field. She called it the Playhouse. So she wrote this poem about that very key that she and I held in our hands to open the door to the kitchen. So that was always that happened time and again when I looked through things that she had, in her work. Some more scenic shot. This is the actual bed that Rachel slept in, with my little cousin in there. And this is an interior of the living room more recently. And one of the reasons I love this island is one of these places where we've never had television they only recently, about a year ago, got high-speed internet, and don't have it in our house yet. But children find their own ways to play. And my kids and their island neighbors and cousins used to put on these plays in the woods and invite all the islanders to come and watch their plays. And I later found out that when Rachel was in college working on playwriting, she directed a bunch of Sutton Island children in one of her plays. So that was another thing she and I discovered, that I discovered that we had in common. So here is Rachel with her dog Spriggan back in probably around 1930. I got this from Portland Public Library. As I went to archive collections, one of the things I got to do was to hold her Newbery medal in my hand. And here's a picture of her Newbery medal from 1929. And the other thing that I got to do and see is her handwriting became extremely familiar to me. And I loved her handwriting. It was very expressive, just like she was, with these big loopy Y's and capital letters and scribbling over each other. A lot of her letters had marginal additions squished into the edges, and sometimes hand drawn and hand colored illustrations to go on them. It just was a very whimsical person, a most incredible, prolific correspondent, an extremely generous friend and supporter of other writers. So this is kind of an amusing one. She says, I'll go down a little bit. As Elizabeth undoubtedly told you, I'm being a most foolhardy creature this summer. Not only buying this bungalow here where we have been so many summers, this is July of 1922. And she started coming to the island, to another house on the island in 1911. So this was a big deal for her. She finally made it big with her plays and had enough money to buy her own house, which I believe is why she called it the Playhouse, also because she liked to play on Sutton Island. Not only, not only buying this bungalow here where we have been so many summers, but also parting company with my movie job. She wrote editorial manuscripts for movies. All goes merrily for the present, but occasionally I do take thought for the morrow, or rather next winter, when I shall probably join the ranks of Highland's bread line, or else take up my stand by the public library lions with a tin cup in my hand. I wish I could have a hand organ and monkey, but you know that New York generally forbids the latter. So it's a pretty good example of her sort of amusing anecdotes in her letter writing. And here she is on Sutton Island. I stumbled on this photograph in an encyclopedia in a library one day and just took me aback because I think I know exactly where she was sitting, just a little ways down the shore from our house. And I figured I'd put in a shot of me with my dogs on our way to Sutton Island on the ferry too. There's my old dog, Kate. So in addition to putting on plays and building moss ferry houses, my children did a lot of reading on Sutton. Here they are some years ago, and almost all of them up to date. My youngest daughter is now married. They're all now married, and the last in-law is the only one missing from this shot. Here is Rachel in one of her later in life promotional photos. And her first book to be made into a film was called All This and Heaven Too. So Rachel moved to Hollywood eventually because when she sold the movie rights to one of her novels, her very first novel, which won the National Book Award in 1935. Again, that triumph allowed her and her husband to marry finally. She was 40 years old when she married and desperately wanted to have children. And they struggled, and I'm sure partly because of her age. And they were not able to have children for quite a while. But in 1939, she finally decided to adopt. And one of the things that I felt like in the course of time, I felt that there was this dovetailing between Rachel's life and mine, because we both had these two strong callings that pulled us. One was writing and one was motherhood. In my case, motherhood took over, and it was probably the most blissful thing I'll ever do. I mean, not saying every moment of mothering was easy or fun, but I adored it. And I raised these four kids for, I'd say mostly full time for about 25 years. But I felt like I was missing this writing life. And Rachel was kind of the opposite. Her writing took off pretty early on. She worked her tail off. Her editors wrote about what a hard worker she was. She longed to have children. So in a way, I felt like the two of us together met the yearnings of each other. And in a way, I feel like it would have made Rachel enormously happy to know that these four little children were running around the deck of the field house playing games and discovering the island for themselves. And then Rachel's gift to me was giving me this incredible story of her life to share with the world. And it's doing very well. It's in its fourth printing right now. So All This in Heaven Too was her second novel, and it was made into a film that was nominated for Best Picture in 1940, I think. And that starred Betty Davis, who is right here, and she and Betty Davis became great friends. So I believe this is from the set of All This in Heaven Too. Now we've jumped back to Sutton Island. This is a guest book in my next door neighbor's house. It's still there today with some of Rachel's silhouette illustrations. One of her signature art forms was to cut out cardboard shapes and then cast silhouettes of them and cut, it just was, I don't even know exactly how it works, but I think about her trying to cut some of these silhouette things with what I must have been tiny little scissors or something. Her silhouette illustrations are phenomenal. And here you could see her signature, and her mother and aunt and sister have all signed the guest book here. She also hooked rugs. She loved doing things with her hands. And this is a hooked rug picture of Bear Island, which is right in that same cluster. She gave gifts to friends so generously and put so much time into it. And she made books. She said once, I literally wrote before I could read, because she could form letters, but liked to listen to poetry and prose read aloud to her. And she talked about her very first book ever. She had no words in it at all. She just sewed all the pages together and admired the blank pages. So she made these little books and gave them to people for presents. She sewed them together. She writes, privately printed at the Playhouse Press, Sutton Island, Maine, 1926. And this was an A through Z note for her favorite editor, who you'll read about in the book. I just love that little drawing. That's at the end of my book. And these are some greeting cards that she illustrated herself. Another shot of Sutton Island's interior. And a sunrise from the porch. There is the house in the evening. You could see my daughter and granddaughter at the base of the stairs here. And I think we finish with my youngest daughter just got married in September. That's in front of another island house. And a couple more scenes. I'm flying through because I know we're kind of getting close to running out of time. So here's a sunset and a sunrise. So I am going to go back to a picture of Rachel Field, because I have another thing which is a fabulous gift to me there was a man named Bruce Commuson who was one of the movers and shakers of the Rachel Field collection on Great Cranberry Island. Sadly, he did not live to see this book finished, which is a terrible tragedy. But he did so much for me, including sending me a radio recording, an MP3 recording of Rachel Field's voice on a radio show, probably around 1939 or 1940. Rachel was famous for being a storyteller, for lighting up a room, for her lilting, charming voice, and I just feel so grateful that I actually have her voice. I'm going to share this with you.
Now we have another star graduate of the Little Red Schoolhouse, one of our girls who has written one of the country's best-selling novels. I'm sure you've all read All This and Heaven Too. If you haven't, you ought to, because it's a great book. It's written by Rachel Field. Come right up here, Rachel. Good evening, my dear. We're all mighty proud of you, Rachel. Imagine you being a great writer. Little Rachel Field, who was always getting ink on her fingers. So, didn't you used to wear your hair long down your back when you were in school, or was it in pigtails?
Oh, I wore them in 2 pigtails down my back. They used to get the ink wells on the desk in back of me.
Oh, yes, I know. Well, you grew up to be a mighty good-looking woman, Rachel, and I wish all our scholars turned out so smart. I declare I talked to one of our boys a week or 2 ago, and he didn't know any more than he did when he was in the 5th grade. I asked him some questions about literature. And my goodness, I guess they're going to make a moving picture out of your novel, Rachel, I think.
Yes, it goes into production this summer.
You're going to write it for the movies yourself?
No, I'm working on a new novel.
Oh, I see. Well, you ought to try writing for the movies, Rachel. One of our boys is doing that very thing, and he's just started at it. He's doing pretty well. In fact, he's ahead of the game. He sent in 2 manuscripts to Hollywood, and they've already sent him back 5. Well, I understand our favorite recitation, or your favorite recitation, is that beautiful poem by Eugene Field, one that is beloved by all children from 6 to 60, called A Dutch Lullaby. That's its proper title, though many people call it Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. And I think that calls for a little music in back of it, don't you, Rachel?
Yes, I do. Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod one night sailed off in a wooden shoe, sailed on a river of crystal light into a sea of dew. Where are you going and what do you wish? The old moon asked the 3. We've come to fish for the herring fish that live in this beautiful sea. Nets of silver and gold had we, said Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. The old moon laughed and sang a song as they rocked in the wooden shoe. And the wind that sped them all night long ruffled the waves of dew. The little stars were the herring fish that lived in that beautiful sea. Now cast your nets wherever you wish, but never afeard are we. So cried the stars to the fishermen 3, Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. All night long their nets they threw for the stars in the twinkling foam. Then down from the sky came the wooden shoe, bringing the fishermen home. 'Twas all so pretty a sail, it seemed as if it could not be. And some folk thought 'twas a dream they dreamed of sailing that beautiful sea. But shall I name you the fishermen 3? Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. Winkin' and Blinkin' are 2 little eyes, and Nod is a little head. And the wooden shoe that sails the skies is a wee one's trundle bed. So shut your eyes while mother sings of the wonderful sights that be. And you shall see the beautiful things as you rock on the misty sea, where the old shoe rocked the fishermen 3, Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod.
Okay. I'll stop sharing now, and I guess I will. I can wrap it up there. I always use up time so quickly. I have poems that I could share with you from Rachel, but I think what I'll give you a chance to ask me some questions. And I think what I would like to say to wrap things up is really that I feel so blessed that I was offered this friendship with someone from the past who I never got to meet. And I never would have imagined that I could forge such a strong bond to someone from back in history. But sharing the house and spending all that time getting to know her childhood, her personal notebooks filled with her childhood poetry, and reading all the letters from her to other people, and the letters that so many people wrote about her, and the outpouring of grief from across the seas and all over the country when she died, convinced me time and time again that she was a terrible loss to the world. And I was determined to bring her light back to the world. But I still feel that she did way more for me than I've done for her, and continues to, as this book journey keeps opening up to new things and new people. One reviewer named Alan Adams in the Main Edge wrote something I really loved, and I like this line from his review. He said, "Before I read this book, I had never known Rachel Field, and now I'll never forget her." So I hope that when you read the book, that you will feel the same way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. I cannot wait to get my hands on this book. It's due soon at the library at Vose, but you have just shared with us such a fascinating story. And you know, when you first wrote that letter in that course you were in, and you asked her if she was mad, she could not possibly be mad after all of this. And, you know, just the care you've taken with that home, and sharing her story with the world. Thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Do we have questions for Robin? Feel free to unmute if you'd like, or can put them in the chat. Everyone's quiet.
Sometimes it takes a minute to warm up to your questions. While you're thinking of your questions, I have one of Rachel's favorite poems that I would like to read for you. Or I shouldn't say, I don't know if it was one of Rachel's favorite poems, but it's many people's favorite poem by Rachel Field. It's about this theme of your outside self not reflecting the real you on the inside, and that frustration that the world doesn't really see who you are. And I think that's a real universal experience. And this theme comes up time and time and again in her poetry, in her children's books, in her novels. So I'm going to read you this book, this very anthologized poem, which you might have encountered somewhere, called My Inside Self. My inside self and my outside self are different as can be. My outside self wears gingham smocks, and very round is she, with freckles sprinkled on her nose, and smoothly parted hair, and clumsy feet that cannot dance in heavy shoes and square. But oh, my little inside self, in gown of misty rose, she dances lighter than a leaf on blithe and twinkling toes. Her hair is blowing gold, and if you chanced her face to see, you would not think she could belong to staid and sober me. Anyone heard of that one before? Oh, how many books did Rachel write? She wrote in the vicinity of 32 books. So a whole lot of books. And some of them, I've got a few I can share with you. Her very first nonfiction book was God's Pocket. Hard to see with the shine. So some of you might have heard of this book. It's a biography of Samuel Hadlock, who was a sea captain who lived in the Cranberry Islands. He was kind of a terrible man, who, but a fascinating man who traveled he was a seal hunter, but then he ended up traveling all over Europe with this big exhibition of artifacts from the north, including an Inuit man and woman and baby, all of whom died during his European travels. It was just a sad tale. But she encountered Samuel Hadlock's grandson, who shared his grandfather's journals with Rachel Field. And this was just a treasure to her. So she and I both wrote books based on historic writings and artifacts. So that was another thing we shared. She also had many books of poetry. I've shown you some of those. Here's a copy of a very worn copy of All This and Heaven Too. But I was going to show you. She wrote a lot of her books were these tiny little books she referred to as juveniles. This one's called The Yellow Shop, and she wrote a lot of books like these that before she broke into literature for adults. But she had wrote 4 novels, and that God's Pocket, and then a bunch of poetry books and many books for children. And some of them were those little ones. But she also was an editor for a lot of books, and contributor, and wrote introductions. And she actually wrote the lyrics for the Ave Maria segment in Fantasia, in Disney's Fantasia. They hired her to be the lyricist for that segment of their famous movie Fantasia. And she was shortlisted to be the screenwriter for Gone with the Wind. So I mean, she was really getting to be a very big deal in Hollywood when she died. Oh, and this is her Caldecott winner, Prayer for a Child. Some of you might have seen that around too. But she was quite something. That was a long answer to your question about how many books.
Any other questions before we close tonight? I'm picturing you, Robin. You've got a whole stash of her around you there. You don't see it, but you keep pulling them.
Yeah, she's here. Oh, and by the way, you can buy the Fieldhouse really anywhere online, but I most encourage you to support your local independent bookstore and order it through them, because I like to support local bookstores. But you can also get it on Amazon and Google Books and Barnes and Noble and Walmart and Target, all those places. It's available online. It's on Kindle too.
Fabulous. Well, Robin, again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'll just close with our ending here, that this concludes our presentation for this evening. And all of us at Vose Library, thank you for attending our Vose Virtual Wednesday series. We hope you'll spread the word and join us on Wednesday, December 1st, when Gary Chapin and Carissa Caro share their book, 126 Falsehoods We Believe About Education. Should be interesting. I hope everybody has a terrific Thanksgiving and that you enjoy good health and stay well. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.